Asterisk. Have you ever wondered what would happen if an entire town forgot how to sleep? Imagine streets glowing with lanterns at midnight, children playing long after the stars have risen, and families sitting on porches with eyes too heavy to stay open, yet never closing. This was the strange reality of Hollow Pines, a community trapped in endless wakefulness. But as their sleepless nights stretched on, they began to notice something unsettling. Shadows that moved without bodies, whispers that slipped through their walls, and figures waiting at the edge of the forest. What they discovered changed the way they saw dreams forever. Tonight, let me take you into the heart of that mystery. The story of the mysteries that haunted the sleepless community. Asterisk. It all began in the quiet valley town of Hollow Pines, a place that looked ordinary by day, but by night revealed its deepest secret. No one could sleep. Imagine closing your eyes at night, the blankets pulled up to your chin, your body tired and aching for rest, yet sleep never comes. Hours stretch into eternity. The clock ticks, the stars shift in the sky, and still, your mind refuses to surrender. Now imagine not just one night like this, but many, and not just for you, but for an entire community. This was the reality of Hollow Pines, a small town tucked into a valley where the forest whispered against the edges of old wooden houses. At first glance, it seemed like any other peaceful countryside place. Children laughed in the mornings, merchants sold fresh bread and fruit in the square, and neighbors greeted each other warmly over fences and garden hedges. But as the sun set and the evening shadows lengthened, Hollow Pines revealed its secret. Its people could not sleep. It didn't happen all at once. In the beginning, it was only a few restless nights for a handful of families. They blamed it on stress, on overwork, on the simple turn of the seasons. But gradually, the sleeplessness spread. One household after another found themselves awake long after midnight, staring at their ceilings, listening to the faint cries of owls in the trees. Soon, the entire town had fallen victim to this strange, unshakable curse. The most unsettling part was not merely the lack of sleep, but the way the town itself began to change under its influence. Normally, a community slumbers when the night arrives, its lights extinguished, its streets silent. But in Hollow Pines, the nights grew louder than the days. Lanterns flickered along the cobbled streets. Families gathered on porches with heavy eyelids, rocking in silence or speaking in hushed voices. Children, too restless to lie still, played marbles under the pale light of the moon. The marketplace, which should have been quiet, sometimes buzzed with activity past midnight. Bakers kneaded dough long before dawn, not because they needed to, but because there was no point in waiting for rest that never arrived. Farmers wandered to their fields, not to work, but simply to walk, hoping that motion might exhaust their weary minds. Even the local schoolhouse rang with children's laughter at hours when most of the world was deep in dreams. The atmosphere was surreal, as though Hollow Pines was trapped in a dreamlike limbo between night and day. And then came the strange sightings. At first, they were brushed aside as tricks of exhaustion. A young woman walking home swore she saw someone pass her by on the empty road. Yet when she turned, there was no one. An old man claimed to see shadows move in his barn, though the cows were asleep and the doors were locked. A group of children pointed to the trees and whispered that they had seen shapes, tall, thin figures, glowing faintly like moonlight itself, drifting among the trunks. The longer the townsfolk stayed awake, the more these sightings increased. Some insisted it was just fatigue, that the mind played games when deprived of sleep. Others believed something darker was at work, that Hollow Pines had opened itself to mysteries unseen by ordinary eyes. And there was something else. The sounds. People reported hearing whispers that floated through their houses at night. They were soft, almost tender, but carried no clear meaning. They weren't the creaks of wood or the rustle of leaves. They were voices, faint, unplaceable voices that seemed to call from nowhere and everywhere at once. No one could deny them, for almost every family eventually heard them. Mothers heard them while rocking their children, merchants while cleaning their shops, and lonely wanderers as they walked beneath the lamplight. At first, these whispers were ignored. Perhaps they were illusions of tired minds. But when they grew louder, echoing through hallways and across the empty square, Hollow Pines could no longer dismiss them. Sleep had abandoned the town, and in its place, something else had arrived. Yet even with fear growing in their hearts, the people of Hollow Pines adapted. Humans are resilient, after all. They created routines to survive. The town council declared night markets so that vendors could sell goods under lantern glow. Families turned insomnia into opportunity, playing board games late into the night or telling stories that carried on until dawn. Musicians gathered in the square, filling the eerie silence with violins, flutes, and soft drums, hoping to drown out the whispers that slid through the cracks of their homes. But beneath this forced cheerfulness lay a tension no one could ignore. The human body was not made to endure endless wakefulness. Eyes grew sunken, hands trembled from exhaustion, and tempers flared easily. Children laughed, yes, but sometimes they cried uncontrollably for reasons no parent could explain. The elderly, more fragile than the rest, weakened quickly, their energy draining as though their very life force was being pulled away. The town had become a place of restless ghosts, not the ghosts of the dead, but of the living, drifting aimlessly through their endless nights. And in the silence between voices, in the moments when lanterns flickered low, every soul in Hollow Pines felt the same chill. They were not alone in their sleeplessness. Something had noticed them. Something had come closer because their eyes remained open night after night. It was only the beginning. It started with a single boy. His name was Elias, a child no older than 10, with wide eyes that always seemed to notice more than others. One night, while sitting on the front steps of his family's wooden house, Elias whispered to his mother that he had heard someone call his name. At first, she thought it was imagination, the kind that comes to restless children who fight against bedtime. But Elias insisted. "They said it softly, Mama," he murmured, tugging at her sleeve, like they were just outside the window. His mother looked into the night. The square was empty, only the faint creak of a swinging signpost moving in the cool breeze. Yet the unease in Elias' voice lingered in her mind long after she tucked him into bed. The following night, it wasn't only Elias. Across Hollow Pines, others began to notice it too, the faint whispers. At first, the voices were like a breeze, almost impossible to distinguish from the rustling of leaves or the distant cries of owls. But as nights dragged into weeks, the voices grew bolder. They came in patterns, sometimes repeating, sometimes rising and falling like lullabies. The strangest part? No one could understand the words. They weren't spoken in English. nor in any language the townsfolk knew. They were unfamiliar, and yet their tone carried meaning. Gentle, coaxing, almost inviting. It was as though the whispers were asking them to follow, to step out of their houses, to walk deeper into the night. Some resisted, locking their doors tightly. Parents warned their children not to listen, pressing pillows over their ears when the voices came. But others grew curious. Curiosity, after all, has always been the twin of fear. A small group of villagers, farmers, merchants, and restless youth decided to test the whispers. One evening, when the murmurs grew strongest, they followed them into the woods. Lanterns in hand, they walked beneath towering pines whose branches scratched at the moonlit sky. What they found there left them speechless. The trees bore symbols, strange markings carved deep into their trunks, spirals and lines that no one could identify. The ground was littered with arrangements of stones, carefully placed in circles and pathways, as if someone or something had been building patterns too deliberate to be chance. And then there were the lights. Small, flickering orbs, no larger than fireflies, but brighter and colder. They drifted between the trees like tiny lanterns carried by invisible hands. When the villagers tried to follow, the lights danced just out of reach, pulling them deeper and deeper into the forest. But the moment they quickened their pace, the lights would vanish, dissolving into the darkness as though they had never existed. When the group returned to town, their faces pale and their lanterns nearly extinguished, they swore they had not gone more than a mile from the edge of hollow pines. Yet they were gone for hours, and not one of them could explain the strange symbols or the lights. Word spread quickly. Some townsfolk believed the forest was alive with spirits, restless beings that awakened when humans no longer dreamed. Others claimed it was a trick, a collective illusion brought on by exhaustion. But Elias, the boy who first confessed to hearing his name, was not so sure. He claimed the whispers were not meant to scare. They sound like they're waiting for us, he told anyone who would listen, like they want to show us something. Many dismissed him, yet in their hearts, everyone wondered the same question. Why now? Why, after generations of peaceful sleep, had the people of Hollow Pines become targets of these midnight voices? Some elders whispered among themselves that perhaps the town had always been cursed, that the sleeplessness came in cycles, returning after long periods of quiet. Others feared it was a punishment, that Hollow Pines had unknowingly broken some ancient pact. No one knew for certain, but the evidence could no longer be ignored. The voices were real. The symbols in the forest were real. The lights were real. And with each passing night, the whispers grew stronger, creeping closer to every doorstep, curling beneath every window, pressing against the ears of every sleepless soul. It was no longer possible to deny it. Hollow Pines was being called, but by whom or by what remained a mystery. When fear begins to grow in any community, people turn to stories of the past. Some search for wisdom in the words of their elders. Others look for clues in traditions and rituals. But in Hollow Pines, the answers, or at least the possibilities, were hidden in its oldest building, the library. The library stood at the very heart of town, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Though small by the standards of great cities, it was vast for a quiet valley community. The townsfolk said it had been built by the very first settlers, long before Hollow Pines had a name. Its roof sloped steeply, and ivy crawled over its outer walls like veins carrying the memory of time. At night, when the lanterns cast their glow upon it, the library looked less like a building and more like a watchful guardian, holding secrets too heavy to be spoken aloud. For years, the library had been neglected. Children rarely visited, and only a handful of scholars kept its shelves from gathering dust. But when the whispers began spreading through the town, and when more and more villagers returned from the woods with tales of strange symbols, people remembered the library again. If there was any place that could explain Hollow Pine's sleepless curse, it was here. One cold evening, a small group of villagers gathered in the library's reading hall. Among them were teachers, elders, and a few younger folk driven by curiosity. The air smelled of parchment and candle wax. The shelves towered high above them, filled with journals, maps, and leather-bound books whose spines cracked with age. They searched in silence for hours, flipping through records of harvests, town meetings, and weather patterns. Most of it was ordinary. But then, one of the teachers, a woman named Clara, pulled a thin, dust-covered volume from the back of a shelf. Its cover was marked with a faded spiral symbol, the same design that villagers had seen carved into the trees of the forest. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, written in ink that had browned with time, were the diaries of the town's earliest settlers. The entries began simply, describing the hardships of building a community in the valley. But soon, the tone shifted. The settlers, too, spoke of sleepless nights, of whispers that haunted their homes, and of lights that danced among the pines. And then came the warning, written in hurried strokes, as though the author had been writing in fear, were these words: "Beware the night of the endless watch, for when sleep deserts us, the dream walkers return." The villagers read on, their hearts pounding with unease. The settlers had described the dream walkers as beings that lived at the edge of human dreams, not alive in the way humans were, but not dead either. They drifted between worlds, feeding on the energy of dreams. Without dreams to sustain them, the settlers claimed, the walkers grew desperate and began to pull themselves into the waking world. One passage, in particular, made the group fall silent. "We thought them harmless shadows, but they are not without hunger. They thrive on our sleep. They take what we cannot give freely. If we close our eyes too long, they may take more than dreams. They may take us." The entries ended abruptly. The final page bore only a smudged drawing, a circle of figures holding lanterns, surrounded by tall, thin shapes with hollow faces. No explanation, no conclusion, just silence, as though the settlers themselves had vanished. Clara closed the diary, her voice shaking as she whispered, "This isn't the first time Hollow Pines has suffered. This has happened before." A heavy stillness settled over the library. Some refused to believe. They argued that the settlers were superstitious, frightened people who mistook exhaustion for monsters. But others remembered the voices, the shadows, the glowing figures glimpsed in the trees. And the more they thought of the sleeplessness that spread across town, the more the pieces seemed to fit. Could it be true? Were the people of Hollow Pines caught in the same cycle as their ancestors, destined to face the dream walkers once again? The group left the library with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain: the curse was not random. It had roots in the past, and if the settlers had once suffered it, then perhaps their warnings held the key to survival. From that night onward, the library became a place of gathering. Night after night, more villagers arrived, searching desperately for other clues buried in the dust of forgotten shelves. They copied the symbols found in the diaries, comparing them with the carvings in the woods. They searched for rituals, prayers, or instructions, anything that might explain how the settlers had endured. But the truth remained elusive. The diaries ended too suddenly, as though the story had been cut short by something too terrible to write. And so, while the rest of Hollow Pines lit lanterns and tried to survive another night without rest, a small group of scholars pressed deeper into their search, driven by a single, unshakable thought. If the dream walkers had returned once before, they could return again. And this time, the sleepless community would have to face them. As days turned into weeks, Hollow Pines reached a breaking point. The sleeplessness was no longer just an inconvenience. It was consuming the town. Farmers collapsed in their fields. Shopkeepers dozed standing behind their counters, and children's laughter turned brittle, fading into sudden bursts of tears. The human body can only endure so much, and Hollow Pines had been awake for far too long. But more troubling than the exhaustion was the sense of being watched. The whispers, once faint, now circled through every home like a draft of cold wind. Entire families would pause in the middle of the night, all hearing the same soft voice gliding through their walls. And sometimes, when lanterns flickered low, shapes would stretch across the floorboards that didn't belong to anyone in the room. The library's discovery spread quickly. The stories of the dream walkers, the ancient warnings of the settlers, the half-drawn figures with hollow faces. Some scoffed, unwilling to believe in tales of shadow creatures. But others felt the truth in their bones. Whatever haunted Hollow Pines was not simply exhaustion or fevered imagination. So, the townsfolk did something rare. They united. The town council, made up of weary elders whose eyes were as red as the lantern flames, called for a gathering. They chose the night of the full moon, believing its light might lend them courage. Notices were sent to every household, and when darkness fell, no one stayed behind. The square that night was brighter than ever before. Every lantern in Hollow Pines had been lit, hanging from posts, windows, and porches. Candles burned in glass jars. Torches lined the streets. The townsfolk gathered shoulder to shoulder, a sea of pale, weary faces illuminated by trembling light. Children clung to their parents, too tired to stand on their own. Dogs barked uneasily, tails tucked. The air was thick, almost heavy, as though even the sky was holding its breath. And then, as the moon reached its highest point, the whispers began. At first, they were like a breeze, barely noticeable against the crackling torches. But soon, they grew stronger, weaving through the crowd like invisible threads. The villagers looked around at one another, wide-eyed, as the voices slipped into their ears. "Come closer. We are here. Do not fear." The crowd shivered. The words weren't in any language they knew, yet somehow they understood. The whispers carried meaning, not through syllables, but through the weight of the sound itself. And then the shadows moved. At the edge of the square, where the torchlight faded into darkness, tall shapes emerged. They were thin, almost impossibly so, their limbs elongated and their bodies shifting like smoke. Their faces were hollow, smooth and pale, with faint glowing orbs where eyes should be. They did not walk, but drifted, gliding forward as though pulled by invisible strings. The dream walkers had come. The crowd froze. Some clutched one another. Others bowed their heads, refusing to meet the creature's gaze. Yet the walkers made no sound, no sudden movement. They simply drifted among the townsfolk, weaving through the sea of lanterns, pausing to hover over families, over children, over the elderly who trembled with weakness. Fear threatened to break the silence, until Elias, the boy who had first heard his name in the night, stepped forward. His mother tried to pull him back, but he shook free, his small frame illuminated by the torches. His voice was quiet, but steady as he asked the question on everyone's mind. "What do you want from us?" The crowd held its breath. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of fire. Then, one of the dream walkers turned toward the boy, its hollow face tilted, and the whispers that followed were no longer scattered, but clear. "We do not seek to harm you." The voices echoed through every mind in the square, though no mouths moved. "We seek what you no longer give, your dreams. Without them, we fade. Without them, you suffer." The words struck the townsfolk like a blow. Their sleeplessness was not merely a curse upon them. It was also a famine for the creatures before them. The walkers were starving, just as the people were. The square remained silent, yet in that silence, realization spread. The sleepless curse was not random. It was a tether. The humans needed dreams to survive, and so too did the dream walkers. One could not exist in balance without the other. For the first time, the townsfolk saw the walkers not as predators, but as beings caught in the same struggle. Shadows, yes, but shadows of hunger, not cruelty. The gathering ended not in violence, but in a fragile understanding. The dream walkers had revealed themselves, and now Hollow Pines would need to decide whether to fear them or to listen. The night of the gathering left Hollow Pines changed. For the first time, the townsfolk had seen the dream walkers with their own weary eyes. And though terror had gripped their hearts at first, the words spoken in whispers lingered longer than the fear. "We do not seek to harm you. We seek what you no longer give, your dreams." The people returned to their homes in silence, each family carrying lanterns back through the stillness of midnight. Yet unlike the nights before, when the whispers had been shapeless and unnerving, now there was a strange clarity. They finally understood what the sleeplessness meant and why their nights had grown so heavy. The dream walkers were not curses. They were not demons. They were companions of the unseen world, beings who had lived alongside humanity since the first spark of fire was lit and the first story was told beneath the stars. They were nourished by dreams, by the wild landscapes of imagination that bloomed when eyes closed and minds wandered freely. Without dreams, the people grew sick and restless. And without dreams, the walkers began to starve, fading until they were nothing but shadows, desperate to be seen. For so long, Hollow Pines had feared them. But now, as the townsfolk sat together in their homes, in inns, and on porches, they began to whisper among themselves. What if fear was not the answer? The following evening, the council gathered once more, this time not in the square, but in the great hall beside the library. Every seat was filled, and the lanterns glowed low, painting the tired faces of hollow pines in soft amber. Elders spoke, children listened, and even those who had once scoffed at the idea of curses leaned in close, hungry for resolution. It was Elias, the boy who had dared to speak to the walkers, who offered the simplest wisdom. Standing beside his mother, he said, "If they want our dreams, then maybe we should give them. Maybe we should stop fighting sleep and trust that rest will help us both." The hall fell into silence, his small voice echoing like a bell. At last, Clara, the teacher who had discovered the settlers' diaries, nodded. "Dreams are not only ours to keep," she said gently. "They are gifts we share with the night. Perhaps the settlers before us forgot this, and that is why they vanished." The townsfolk murmured their agreement. For once, the answer did not seem to be in walls or weapons, but in surrender. That night, Hollow Pines tried something different. Families gathered together in their bedrooms. They set aside their fears and blew out their lanterns. Mothers rocked their children slowly, not with anxious songs to keep them awake, but with lullabies to soothe them into slumber. Fathers laid down their tools. Elders closed their weary eyes. And for the first time in months, the people of Hollow Pines welcomed sleep. At first, nothing happened. The stillness of night pressed down upon them, heavy as ever. But slowly, like water seeping through dry earth, dreams began to return. A child dreamt of chasing butterflies across endless fields. A young woman dreamt of the sea, its waves sparkling like glass. An old man dreamt of his youth, of holding hands with the wife he had lost long ago. And in those dreams, unseen by waking eyes, the dream walkers fed, not greedily, but reverently. They drifted like shadows at the edges of dreamscapes, soaking in the colors, the stories, the wild beauty of imagination. Their hollow faces glowed faintly, filled not with hunger, but with calm. When dawn arrived, the people of Hollow Pines awoke to something they had nearly forgotten: peace. Their bodies no longer trembled. Their minds no longer burned with restless fire. For the first time in what felt like forever, they felt whole. The whispers had faded. The shadows had retreated. But the townsfolk knew now that the walkers had not gone. They had simply returned to where they belonged, dwelling quietly in the space between sleep and waking, guardians of dreams rather than thieves of them. From that day forward, Hollow Pines honored the balance. Each month, on the night of the full moon, families would gather in silence and close their eyes together, offering their dreams freely to the unseen ones. It was not fear that bound them anymore, but a pact, a quiet understanding that dreams are not only personal journeys, but bridges to another world. Generations passed, and the story of the sleepless season became a legend told to children before bed. Parents reminded their little ones never to fear the dark, for in the dark, dreams blossomed, and with them, the harmony between worlds. And so Hollow Pines was restored, not by fighting shadows, but by embracing the simplest truth, that in every dream lies both healing for the human heart and sustenance for the mysterious companions of the night. So, if ever you find yourself restless, unable to sleep, remember the lesson of Hollow Pines. Close your eyes gently and trust that your dreams are not wasted. They are gifts, drifting outward, joining a tapestry far greater than yourself. And who knows, perhaps, somewhere, a dream walker thanks you. Asterisk. And so, dear listener, the mystery of hollow pines reminds us that dreams are more than just fleeting visions of the night. They are gifts shared between worlds, and they keep both the human heart and the unseen alive. If you've enjoyed this journey and wish to hear more stories like it, I invite you to gently tap the like button and subscribe to this channel. It helps me bring you more tales of mystery, history, and wonder, stories made to guide you softly into rest. Until we meet again, may your night be peaceful and may your dreams be kind. Asterisk.